As always, I'm glad to be here with you all. And thank you for encouraging me by your presence, and thank you for caring about God and His kingdom and His people. We've had a lot of people out for sickness and travel, and it's good to see you all back. Heidi's beginning to feel a lot better than what she was earlier, and so it is good to be back with you all. For those who may be visiting, you're coming into a series. We've been slowly working through Colossians, and particularly in this section of Colossians 3, we slowed down for a couple of reasons. One, it was requested to have some more lessons on Christian conduct and attitudes and things like that, and that's what Paul's talking about in this section. But also, as we noted several lessons ago, this text does give us some tools to wrestle with temptation, to try to resist fleshly indulgence. And I didn't want to just skip over looking at how do we apply that to the things Paul lists in this section of the text in Colossians 3. And I really thought we were going to finish this paragraph today. That was my plan. We're going to finish the last couple things he lists and move on into the next section. But as, in fact, I actually had the whole PowerPoint to put together. But as I was practicing the sermon, I just realized there's probably a lot more questions about the first thing on this list. It's a lot less self-evident or self-explanatory, and so I thought we needed to make sure we took time to wrestle with that. Also, for those who are visiting, a very quick refresher. If you want to hear more, you can go back and listen to the sermons. They're on YouTube as well as Facebook. Let us know. We'll get you the link if you want to hear more in detail. But at the end of chapter 2, Paul talks about some things that look like they would help you resist fleshly indulgence. They look like it help you to overcome the base nature of the old man. But he says, but they don't actually. And he mentions self-made religion as one of those. He also mentions severe treatment of the body that appear to have to be wise, appear to be useful, but aren't actually going to help you resist the indulgences you're trying to get away from. And at the beginning of chapter 3, he instead starts talking about things that will. And so verse 1 and 2, he says, if you have been raised with Christ, then seek the things above and set your mind on things above. So Paul's solution is basically you're going to act in a certain way, and then you're going to think in a certain way. And we've made the point throughout these sermons that order is probably significant because it's easier to change action than it is to change attitude. It's easier to change what I'm physically doing than how I'm feeling. And so he's saying you're going to first take action, and then while you're doing that, you're going to be trying to change the way you're thinking, trying to change the way you're feeling. So in chapter 3, 5 through 11, that shows up in this way. It says you're going to treat or act as if your body has died to those fleshly indulgences. So it's like your arm got cut off, or like you had a stroke and you're paralyzed from the waist down. You can no longer use that part. Now Paul knows that in reality, you could still give in to the indulgence, but you're going to act as if you can't. And while you're doing that, you're going to be reminding yourself that you are being renewed, you're being made back into the image of God. And that phrase renewal is important because, as Genesis 1 tells us, all people at the point of their creation are made in God's image. And it's when we sin that we corrupt that image, we mar that image. And what Jesus is doing in the Gospels, in the gospel message and plan and action, is he's renewing that image in us. And so I want to make this point as well here that it's very easy to think Christianity, what makes a person a Christian is that they do good things. But that's not the way the New Testament talks about it. As he says here, the reason you're putting off the old man, this is down in verse 9, you're stripping off the old self, and you're putting on the new self because you're being renewed to this true knowledge. Or the sister letter of Ephesians in chapter 2, 8 and 9, he says you're saved by grace through faith, not of yourselves, his gift of works. But in verse 10, he says, why? Why did God save you? One of the reasons is because you are his workmanship to do good works. And so the good works, the good life a Christian lives results from the salvation. It's not the thing that attains to the salvation. It's not the thing that makes you a Christian. But if you are a Christian, this is the way you're going to live because you're being changed. You're being renewed to God's image. And so seeing ourselves in that way and changing the way we think about ourselves is his thought idea from the section. So we summarized these big categories. These are broad things. Lots of things fit into these indulgences: sexual morality, impurity, passion, evil desire. And we've been focusing on this list. So the last lesson we looked at anger and wrath and malice and slander, which I think are subsets or specific ways that you could have passion or evil desire that is a fleshly indulgence. And my plan was to do obscene speech, lying, and then the last thing in verse 11. But when I was putting together and practicing the obscene speech section, I realized there's a lot of questions here that I think we would take time and wrestle with. So you're going to have one more lesson on this. If you want to think about this as a mini excursion, like a break in Colossians, we're doing a topic series of topical lessons, that's fine. And so he says this obscene speech is you're going to treat your body as dead to that. And because it's speech, the part that's self-evident is the fact, okay, so if certain speech is inappropriate or not what a new, renewed person would be doing, well, then you stop that. You just stop using that speech. You stop using those words. You stop talking that way. That's pretty self-explanatory. The not explanatory part is, well, what's obscene speech? There is no book in the Bible dedicated to answering that question. I don't even know of a single section of text dedicated to answering that question. What makes speech filthy language, as the version read earlier? What makes speech obscene? Like, what counts and what doesn't count? That is a hard question, and that's the thing I thought we needed to take time and wrestle with, so we have some kind of working definition to operate on. I can say I'm going to stop obscene speech, but if I don't want to know what that is, I don't know what I'm going to do about that. So this is where I think the umbrella category of impurity is actually really helpful in beginning to wrap your head around this. Back when we did that first lesson, laying the groundwork of chapter 3, I suggested that impurity is, spiritually speaking, is anything that mars the soul, that harms your soul, that corrupts your soul, drawing it further away from God. And so this is a subcategory of that, and that would mean that obscene speech is any speech that's going to harm our soul or the souls of other people. It's going to draw them further away from God. But what kind of speech would do that? One of the really fascinating things to me is in studying languages. So in high school, I studied Latin. In college, I studied Greek and Hebrew. When I was little, we lived in Hungary. I had friends who spoke Spanish. And so I've been exposed to a lot of languages across my lifetime. And I've been told a lot about filthy speech in other languages. And I've been fascinated by a common pattern. I want you to think to yourself, and I assume you probably have enough exposure to other languages to answer this question yourself. What language or phrases or words or concepts do cultures across the world consider obscene or filthy language or inappropriate speech? And there's a surprising pattern. It's surprising if there is no God. I'll say it that way. If there is no God from whom life originates and morality originates, it is surprising that human culture across languages and cultures would have this consistency. That here are phrases you're not supposed to say, or here are things you're not supposed to say. And they almost always fall into two categories, either referring to things that are holy concepts or entities, or holy relations. Here's what I mean by that. Think about the obscene language in English, things that would be considered obscene, or words that are considered obscene, curse words, profanity. They are either going to relate to holy ideas. So the word hell, the word damnation, and its abbreviation damn, refer to the judgment of God that, as Ezekiel 18 says, he takes no pleasure in. But because of his justice, he has to act on it. One of the clearest places to see this idea of being holy is in Isaiah 5:10, where he talks about God's judgment coming, and he's going to prove his holiness in righteousness. Righteousness is not only doing what is right personally, but also rendering fair judgment. And that is, his holiness is seen in his fair judgment and his wrath. Or it has to do with relations, particularly the marriage relationship. You think about words that are considered profanity or curse words in English. They are either going to fall into the religious category, or they're going to fall into something that relates to the marriage relationship that is holy. And what's amazing to me is that's true across languages. The closest exception I've run across is in Britain. The word bloody is often used as a curse. We don't do that in English. We don't see it that way in English, meaning American English. But if you look it up in Encyclopedia Britannica and other sources, they'll suggest that maybe the reason that came to be is because people thought they were referencing the blood of Christ in an irreverential way. And so even that word is connected to this idea of disregarding the holiness of God. And I think it's so important to take the time to consider this because, stop when you think about it for a second. We speak English, but if someone showed up and spoke Chinese, I don't know if anyone here knows Chinese, we'd know they're speaking a language, but it would be gibberish to us. Same thing if someone showed up and spoke Swahili, or someone showed up and spoke Portuguese. Unless you know the language, it's gibberish. It's just a bunch of sounds. And so even as a young person, I would wonder, why does God seem to care how people talk? Like, it's just sound. In one language, it means nothing, and it's just words. Why would God have this? Because it's not just in Colossians he says this. He says in Ephesians 4. He says in Ephesians 5. James 3 says has some of the same kind of ideas. Why would God care? And it's because when I have defiant uses of holy concepts like God's judgment in hell, or defiant uses of sexual words, I am acting like a man who has recognized the restrictions of God and God's authority and God's domain, and I'm saying I'm going to have none of that. I mean, it's just, if you stop and think about it for a second, it's kind of crazy we have words in any language you're not supposed to say. Like, why does that exist? Why in the world do we have words you're not supposed to say? And it's because ultimately, as men, it goes back all the way to Genesis 3, when Satan is tempting Eve and says, you will be like God. We don't like being told we're not supposed to do things, including how we talk, and so we sometimes create words. And it's not arbitrary, because I do think it's almost always connected to these ideas. God has put restrictions on conduct. He's put restrictions on relations. And so we don't like him being in control. And so I'm going to take his holy things and I'm going to treat them as not holy. I'm going to treat them as common. In fact, the words profane and vulgar that we usually connect to the idea of obscene speech or filthy language, they literally just mean treating something as common. There's nothing wrong with treating ordinary things in an ordinary way. What brings the negative concept or negative connotation into that is when we're taking holy things, things that are special, and then we talk about them in ordinary ways. And so, obscene speech, and again, I've listed very few because it's not just the sounds, as I was saying earlier, and it's maybe not just the words, because there are contexts in which you can use those words in reverential and holy ways, and it's perfectly acceptable speech. It's not obscene speech. It's not speech that draws me further away from God, that mars my soul. But when you realize that that really is a very broad category, you couldn't list all the things that could obscene speech, because obscene speech is anything that would draw me further away from God. It's anything that would harm my soul, the souls of those around me, in the way I talk. And there's no way to make a whole list of all the things you could possibly say that could do that. But these are the kinds of typical things that we run across. And so, again, still under this treating our body as dead to obscene speech, well, what else do we do? Well, one of the things we can do is we practice talking about holy things in holy ways and with sanctity and reverence. I'll give you just one illustration from Jesus. In his model prayer in Matthew 6, he opens up the prayer by saying, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." One of the ways to practice and get into the habit of talking about holy things in holy ways is by, in our prayers, making a point to acknowledge to God we recognize that whatever the thing is holy. His name, his nature, the relationship in marriage, that these are holy things. And because they're holy, they're good things. In our discussions with each other, we can make a point to acknowledge each other, just talk about what we're reading, what we've been thinking, and we make a point to talk about things that are holy in holy ways. You acknowledge that to one another. Because when you verbalize that, it's going to help us to remember to think that way. Remember, we're taking the action first, and then we're also going to try to change the way we think. So this is also challenging and confusing because you're like, okay, so how do I change my thought process about my speech? Because speech is almost entirely an action, right? Well, one thing I would suggest as an effort to see ourselves as the image of God in our speech would be training ourselves to hear the words we think more. Speech is so natural for us as people that often we will say things without even realizing. Now, we did think it, but it was a really, really fast thought. It's really amazing things about people. We can get really good and really fast at tasks we repeat a lot. And talking is one of those tasks. And so we can end up talking so fast and thinking so quickly in those regards that we're not conscious of the words coming out of our mouth. The more I train myself to be thoughtful about my speech in general, the less likely I'm going to be speaking obscene things, especially accidentally. That I'll be thinking about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. And so that's kind of a general thought process. This is a little bit more specific to our situation. In addition to catching how we're thinking and how we're considering, training ourselves to think wholly concept of reference. And here, let me flesh it out because it's a super broad category, broad statement. What does that mean? I'll use marriage as that is one of the illustrations. It's one of the things that tends to fall into the obscene speech category, the filthy language category. Words or concepts tend to disregard the sanctity of marriage. So in Hebrews 13:4, the writer says, marriage is to be held in honor among all. Marriage is a good thing. It is an honorable thing. And the marriage bed is to be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterers. And he makes this very plain statement that marriage is to be held in honor. And the marriage relationship that is unique to spouses is to be held in honor and to be treated as undefiled. It's related to the concept of holiness. And so what might that look like? So I'll come back to that point in a second. I'll make this point first. So as I'm thinking about speech and how I should talk as the image of God, because that's one of the points he's making in this section. He says, the reason you're putting off these old fleshly indulgences, that you've given in to these actions, these attitudes, and you're no longer going to act that way, is because you're being made into a new person. And as that new person, as the image of God, one of the things you're going to appreciate is what God appreciates in Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, he creates the world, and after each day, he looks at his creation and says, it was good. He sees the goodness of what he has made. He sees the beauty of his creation. And this is true of all holy things. It's one of the reasons why God, when he has to make the tabernacle and make the temple, it's not just a plain wall that's gray. It is decorated and covered with pictures of palm trees and flowers and cherubim, because God is trying to physically convey in those objects the beauty of his holiness. That all holy things carry an innate beauty. It's one of the reasons why you, as a special creation of God, as a unique person who's made in that image of God, is beautiful, regardless of what you look like physically. You have an innate beauty because you bear the image of God. And when we're being renewed into that image, part of what's happening is that beauty is becoming clearer and clearer. You are a gem that's being refined and cut, and that's not always a fun process. But the innate beauty that exists in you as an image of God is becoming more and more radiant. And so as we think about and meditate on how do we change the way we think about our speech, taking the time to spend, whether it's in prayer, in one-on-one conversations, or just on your own, maybe you're journaling, taking time to think about what makes God's holy things beautiful. Specifically, I'll apply it to the marriage relationship. So growing up, and I understand why this happened, and I don't think this is bad in itself, but growing up, we didn't really talk about the marriage relationship and the uniqueness. And there's reasonable reasons to do that. Because sexual temptation is one of the strongest temptations humans experience, and God is very strict about what He expects people to do and how to act in that regard. But what that meant for me personally is there was a vacancy in my mind. Okay, so this is basically bad, except in this one exception. And I wasn't taught how to think about the beauty of what God has created. Because the marriage relationship is holy. It is a physical representation of holiness. That you have a unique relationship with your spouse that you share with no one else. That's part of the goal of God creating marriage, is to convey that. And I wasn't helped to understand why that's a beautiful thing. And why any other perversion of that is a disregard of God's holiness. And while any other perversion of that does not appreciate this amazing thing God has made. And so I urge you to take time to consider the beauty of God's holy matrimony and why it's beautiful. Parents, I encourage you to talk to your kids about these ideas so that you don't leave a vacancy in their mind for the world to fill with their thoughts and their philosophies and their ideas. But instead fill them with God's explanation of what He has made and why it is amazing. And if we take time to see the beauty of God's holy things, we're far less likely and far less inclined to then treat those things in our speech as ordinary and common. Going back to the point I skipped when I said taking care of how I think about holy concepts. It's one of the reasons why you couldn't make a list of all the words or phrases you're not supposed to say. Because I can take words that don't fall in those categories and I can use them to disregard the holiness of God anyway. This is the reason I don't use euphemisms. And if there's ever a euphemism that I use that causes you to kind of think about a holy concept, God's name, God's nature, whatever, in a way that is not reverential, let me know. And I will stop. Just because of the closeness. This is why we don't say in our house, we don't say, oh my God. But we also don't say, oh my gosh. Because it is an intentionally replacement word. The thought still happens. And I want our household, and I want to encourage others outside of our household to reverence God's name. But in fact, recently, one of my girls pointed out how, oh my goodness, is very similar. And so as a household, we decided, okay, we're going to not use that one. Because we want people to reverence the name of God. We want people to value Him and see His beauty and when they think about Him. And that's why you couldn't make a list. Because for you, there might be some random word that I use that causes you to not have the proper reverence of a holy concept. If there is, let me know, and I will adjust my language because I want you to reverence God and His things the way He sees them and sees the goodness in them. And that's what I mean by thinking carefully about holy concepts and taking care with this. And so I'd urge us to, in addition to the words that the culture agrees are bad, don't use those because they exist essentially to be a defiant rebellion against God's restrictions. But think about how you use euphemisms and ask, does this reverence God's holy things or does it not? So, for instance, we'll just make up one. It's going to chuckle. But I wouldn't say, oh, my deity. No one says that. But if I'm using that as a replacement for, oh, my God, then I've not accomplished anything. I'm still thinking about God, and I'm still talking about a divine being. It's a different word. It's not His name. But if I'm using it as basically just an exclamation, then I'm not reserving thoughts of his name and his nature and his character for places of reverence. Now, to clarify, you don't have to talk quietly about holy things. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a proper place and proper way to talk about those things. And that's Paul saying. The old man the old man did this. This is common for the old man. But as the image of God, that is no longer going to be the natural thing for you to do. That's no longer going to be the thing that you partake in, because, and again, this is also something else about the thinking. The image of God desires to understand why. Now, sometimes we can't always clearly answer that, but this one we can. The image of God wants others to fear God's judgment. That God's wrath is partially, and it's not the only motivation God offers for people to follow him, but it is the starting motivation. In the story of Israel that Trevor brought in the sermon recently, he says, I wish that you would be afraid so you would always follow me and stay in this covenant and I can bless you. I wish you to fear my wrath and fear my judgment. If I am God's image, so if I'm a Christian, if I'm a saint, I'm being renewed to that image. And if I am God's image, I want people to fear God's judgment, to see the holiness of God in his fair justice. And I want people to revere God's creation of marriage, the relationship that most entirely represents humanity's relationship to God. That represents the nature of God and his holiness. That represents the love and the affection God feels for mankind, and the trust and the submission that mankind should have toward God. And if I'm the image of God, I want people to see that. I want people to hear that. And so, when it comes to words or phrases that treat things in relationship to God's holy matrimony as common or ordinary, I don't want to talk that way. This is something Satan has done so well in our culture, particularly with the concept of hell. Hell is one of the most common profane words you hear, and here's one of the reasons that's dangerous. Not because you can't talk about hell. You can. But we hear it so often. The vast majority of the world does not fear hell. They don't fear being cast away from the presence of the one where life comes from, and light comes from, and goodness comes from. They don't fear that because they hear this word all the time throughout their day. It's common. It is ordinary. There is no reaction that, yeah, that's a scary concept. I should be careful about that. Satan's done a really good job making it ordinary. And ordinary things do not scare us. And so, when Jesus dies, he dies to make us new people. He dies because he wants every person to be saved. He dies because he wants to bring out the radiance of God that innately exists in all people. And my speech can either help that or hinder that. Obscene speech is going to harm my soul and the souls around me, drawing us further away from the source of light and life and goodness. And that's why, as the new person, it's no longer natural for me to talk that way. Because again, as I've said before, natural doesn't mean easy. Again, go back to my butterfly illustration with the monarchs flying across to South America every winter. Natural doesn't mean easy, but it does mean it is the normative action. And if I don't start seeing myself as the image of God and saying, well, how would the image of God act normally? How would the image of God think normally? I'm going to really struggle. Changing speech is one of the hardest things. But if I want souls to reverence God and his holy concepts, I'm going to strive to change it so that my language supports that endeavor. Because I want their soul as well as my soul to be saved. And Jesus died to make that possible. If you are ready to submit and accept that gift, if you are convinced that Jesus is the Son of God, that he came to the earth and he died and was raised for your sins, and you're willing to make him your Lord and tell the world around you, confess to the world around you, he is your Lord, which means repenting of the things we're called to repent of, we're ready to help you make that choice. We're ready to help you to submit to him in baptism. If you don't know what that means and need more information, we're ready to help you understand that. If you are a saint and the world has deceived you, Satan has deceived you on any of the things we've talked about, and you need specific accountability, that's one of the things I meant to bring up in the application. Like, it's notorious. Anyone who's grown up not following the Bible in general, not controlling their speech in general, and even those who have, and they realize, I got to change the way I talk, it is notoriously difficult to do that. Because it's one of those habits we do almost without thinking it. Like, the thinking happens so fast that it's almost like we didn't think. Find an accountability partner who can help you and aid you. Who you can say, yeah, I struggled. I said this again this many times. And again, you want someone who's going to be patient with you and compassionate with you in doing that. But find someone who's going to help you be accountable. Because when you know you have to tell someone you're going to do something, it's a pretty good motivation to say, I'm going to really work on that. So if we can help you in any way, spiritually, let us know as we stand and as we sing.